Good evening. Welcome to session 3 of the Clergy Roundtable, our fall 2021 series. These few weeks we are discussing the book Searching for Sunday by Rachel Held Evans. And I am joined by my colleagues on my right, Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris Ewing. She's the assistant minister here at Naples UCC. And on my left, Reverend Dr. Dawson B. Taylor, our senior minister. So it's a privilege to have both of you with me tonight.
Just like God, one on the right, one on the left.
That's right, on my right and on my left. Before we get started, I want to offer some words of thanks and gratitude because producing Clergy Roundtable is a team effort. It is not just Sharon, Dawson, and myself. So thanks to our production team, Sean, Drew, and Brad, who do all the behind-the-scenes tech stuff, who make it possible for you to view this on a screen if you're doing that, or to listen to it through a podcast if that's the way you're connecting with us. And also thank you to our executive assistant, Wendy Gaillere, who helps us out with this project as well. For those of you who are following along, we are on session 3 tonight of this book. Rachel divides her book into the holy orders, which is the sacraments as she defines them. And we are looking this evening at pages 97 through 117. And we will begin with chapter 3, which is only pages 97 and 98. And it's about hands and the importance of hands in ministry, the importance of hands in our lives, the importance of physical touch in connecting with one another. She talks about the laying on of hands at our ordinations, which you'll hear me ask my colleagues about in just a few moments. But one quote that I think really captures her message in a nutshell, she says on page 98, "The hands of a pastor will baptize babies. They will type out sermons and draw crosses of ash over penitent brows. They will break bread, pour wine, and shelter unwieldy Advent flames. They will grasp the speckled arms of the elderly, the sticky fingers of toddlers, the trembling hands of the sick, and lifeless palms of the dead." So Sharon and Dawson, what did you make of her reflection on hands in ministry?
Well, I just thought it was a beautiful quote about all the things that our hands do. And I know we'll talk more about touch and the importance of that. But some of you know that back in May, I broke my wrist in a couple places and took a long time healing. So I've really been aware of my hand and how there's so much that we do with our hands that we take for granted. And when they first told me after the surgery, oh, you're going to have occupational therapy, I'm like, why? What would I need that for? But when my hand came out of all the cast and splint, I literally could not bend my fingers to make a fist or to do a lot of other things. So I've really had a new appreciation for simple acts that we do with our hands that we take for granted. And the hands are just powerful.
Yeah, and I remember you kind of being on that journey. I mean, I remember not being able to drive, especially like when you were fresh out of surgery, like with the cast. And I mean, not to overshare, but I just remember how frustrating that was. And, and that was, I think it was that reminder for all of us who call you friend and colleague. And I think for me, it was that reminder as someone who is single, lives alone. I love him, but I don't think my Labrador counts in this context. But hopefully coming out of the pandemic, I've just been really reminded of. And as my boundary training as a clergy person reminds me, the appropriate touches and hugs and.
Thank you for that. Appropriate touch.
Yeah, but I'm an extrovert. I love people, and I'm from the South, so I'm accustomed to lots of hugs and being hugged. And when the pandemic first started, we were so unclear and uncertain about how the coronavirus was spread, and so really, the go-to was you don't touch, you didn't hug it. And in many ways, we're still not doing a lot of that, which is understandable. But again, as someone who does not have a spouse and lives by myself, like I began to realize, and I wasn't traveling to see friends and family and things like that, I began to realize how those simple things like a hug, a handshake, were so increasingly meaningful And so I think about and have reflected so much on what the pandemic has taken from us, but that was something that was given to me. That, as I try to say, like on my healthiest days, I can really reflect that it was a really important reminder about isolation, about those appropriate touches and hugs, and and how we need, as the body of Christ, to be present, and as friends and family of choice, to be present for people, and how I can still miss those when it's still not normal. I think normal is a dangerous term in these days, but I missed that, and it was a really important reminder that I don't think I would have had in any other way. But her writing, again, she's just such an eloquent writer, but it just was such an important reminder of those times.
When you talk about the pandemic, and it just brings back lots of, we are still in it, but
Yeah.
in a very different place than a year ago.
Sure.
But I think about all the lessons we learned and all of the things that we had to figure out. How do we do ministry? How do we touch people emotionally, spiritually, even socially, if we can't touch them physically? I don't think we figured it all out, but we did learn a lot of lessons. And what's the big unknown is, what's it going to be like 6 months from now? What's it going to be like a year from now? I don't think we know.
Well, I think about, how Naples Community Hospital, NCH, still, they lifted it some this summer, but it's gone back into effect. Clergy are not allowed into the hospitals yet. And I just think about, what does pastoral care look like? What does congregational care look like in those types of experiences? It's a completely different model of how to be the church. And like you said, we haven't figured it out. Some days we're better at it than others, but that's just the reality of ministry today. Is literally, we understand as a team, you're adapting day by day. It's never the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that touch is imperative in our ministries, but also just for our literal physical well-being. And I think so often we get our heads and our bodies get disconnected. Yeah. But I've read before that in order to stay healthy, you're supposed to receive 7 hugs a day. You think about like vulnerable, premature, tiny babies in neonatal intensive care units and how essential it is for them to be touched. And if their parents can't do it, they're volunteers that literally all they do is hold and cuddle babies, and nurses do it. When my 2 sons were born, the first thing they do is have mom touch them. It's important for elderly people who are in assisted living and nursing home facilities who are isolated to receive physical touch from their caretakers, and that we really deteriorate without that. And so I can't help but wonder, going forward, even when it becomes safe to physically touch one another again, has our society become, or at least this generation who will be alive, that remembers the pandemic? Maybe things will shift long after we're gone and the pandemic is only read about in history books by future generations. But for all of us who've lived through it, is our relationship to touch and one another permanently altered? I have friends who have said, I didn't get sick for the first time last cold and flu season because I didn't touch anybody and I wore my mask. And so even when COVID, is a distant memory, I'm still not going to touch people in cold and flu season, and I'm still going to wear a mask, and I'm still going to keep my distance. And there's this sense of this act, which is supposed to bring healing and connection, is seen as dangerous, and is a liability, and is physical touch is risky. And so I just reflect a lot on how that affects our informal relationship networks, like friendships, family of choice, but also our more formal organizing, like churches.
Yeah, and it also brought up, it's kind of in the spirit of who Rachel Held Evans was, but I think about in the early days of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the great fear that caregivers, medical caregivers had, and all people, clergy and families and others. And there are some famous pictures. One was on the cover of Time, of people who were lying in bed, dying and wasting away. And because of the fear that surrounded, and in many ways still does, that disease, people were not being touched because of, again, this ignorance about how the disease is spread. And I just think about, you mentioned the word isolation a moment ago, and I think about how powerful that, not only that word, but that experience is. And I think about, and that's not the only disease that has created that for people, but I just think about isolation. And I think the pandemic has caused me to reflect a lot on people who feel isolated, be it disease or social situation or whatever that might be, and how we as the church and the hands of Christ are called to address that at some level. So I think it's a personal challenge that I have felt and continue to kind of grapple with, is what's my part in that.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
Oh, no, I said them.
Trust me, if Sharon has thoughts, you'll know.
She'll share them. Okay. I just want to give you an opportunity. I would also add that I think about Jesus and the stories we hear about him in the Gospels, and they are so focused on touch, whether it's people touching him, like the garment of his hem, or the hem of his garment, the woman being healed, or him laying hands on people, him touching people. If you removed physical touch from Jesus' healing stories, it'd be radically changed. And I mean, you mentioned the HIV/AIDS crisis. In Jesus' day, it was lepers.
Right.
People that had leprosy were social pariahs. You did not touch them. And Jesus' actual physical act of laying hands on people and touching them and healing them was socially one of the many socially transgressive things that he did. So touch can seem so simple, but it can actually be revolutionary.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things I love about that story of when the hem of his garment is touched is how Jesus is aware that the power goes out from him. That's one of those things that, it's like one of those nuanced things that always catches my attention. And, I think I think there's a lesson there for each of us about recognizing the power of touch and how we can see that power and how God has placed that intimacy within each of us and how we can be a part of that pattern.
Well, and we sort of recreate that. We embody that when we do the laying on of hands in ordination. And I know from talking with you all that's just been a powerful experience in our lives. And certainly, I think not only of having been the recipient of that, but of times when I've been one of the people laying hands on others, and that would be an experience that many people in our congregations would have had, that's just a powerful way to express that sense of the power of touch and, in that case, the sense of anointing leaders, but that's another way we use our hands.
And you were ordained at your home church, right?
I was.
Yeah. And you were ordained here in Florida and St. Pete. Yeah.
Lakewood United Church of Christ.
Yeah.
Quick plug.
Go to the website. And
where were you ordained?
I was ordained at Cathedral of Hope, my previous congregation, because I went to work there. I'd grown up Methodist, and so that was my congregation that I came into the United Church of Christ. And what I remember physically about touch with my ordination was the weight of the hands, because I had several clergy who were part of the initial act of ordination, then others who prayed for me. But I just remember kind of thinking like, okay, God, I get it. Like this is the mantle here is heavy. Like I get it. But, I do think, like you said, Sharon, I appreciate raising that opportunity of the opportunity to lay hands on others as well as having hands laid on you is a unique gift. I mean, I've done it a handful of times, and I never take it for granted. I mean, it's a unique opportunity.
That embodied ritual is
without
powerful,
a doubt,
and very rarely is it used in services because I think the importance of it.
No, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I thought about that.
So we'll move right along to the next chapter called Mission. And this is the longest chapter in this section. And Rachel writes beautifully, what I would describe as heartbreakingly, about her experiencing starting and closing a new church called The Mission. They started off in an apartment above a funeral home. I gathered probably about 20 people or so. They eventually moved to a storefront, as she describes it, in the shape of a bowling alley. And then they eventually dwindled. And I want to share that piece. She said, and we don't have to dwell on the closing of it. We will come back to the vibrancy of it in her other reflections. But she does say on pages 108 and 109, the mission collapsed slowly. 1 week at a time, first as participation stagnated, then as it waned, then as it bucked under the financial strain. There were no big fights, no dramatic exits, no one that we know of left disgruntled or hurt. A few of our members moved away, others burned out, and the rest of us stayed even after the torpor set in. The inertia that comes with watching your time, energy, and money melt away. Have either of you ever been part of a congregation that closed, or did you have love for a congregation that you left and then later find out that it closed or was closing? And if you had either of those experiences, would you share what that was like for you?
Yes, it's interesting because it's kind of both of those. Not that I was in the church, but the church that I grew up in was a new church plant in the 50s. There were lots of them. And it was a Baptist church that was being founded by a man who was the associate at another Baptist church, like further in suburb. So this is moving a little bit further out suburb. And he was a little bit older than my parents, but very much same generation, and attracted a lot of young families. So we never got to be a big church. It was always relatively small, but there were a lot of families that all grew up together. And I am amazed at some of the expressions that I hear from people I grew up with about feeling this great connection, and we had something really unique and special. And my parents continued to be in that church for many years. And I think what happened was that generation of young families was never replaced. So the core of the church remained, and people joined and left, but the core stayed and got older and older and older.
I was saying they kind of aged out.
They aged out. And it became smaller, and there were some theological differences that had always been held in tension because they were both Southern Baptists and American Baptists, and there were some who were more conservative and some who were more progressive. But by the time they closed a couple years ago, it was really the right thing. And I think there was some mourning, but it was for what had been. It was not for what the church was at that moment, because there was just a sense of this is what has to happen. And I've reading this and thinking about your questions, I've thought, I don't think of it as failure. It's like it was a strong and meaningful church for a significant group of people over time, but it was for a time and place, and that came to an end. So I loved it, and I wish other people could have that kind of experience, but when it closed, it was no longer what it had been. And it was hard, but it was also not hard in the sense that you just knew this is what has to happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, Sharon won't mention this, but I think it's really special that they invited you to be a part of some of the ritualistic things that took place in helping it close, honoring the fact that you had come into ministry from there, which I think, to me, as a friend and colleague, was important as part of what they needed to do to kind of wrap up, so to speak,
Well, it's all
life and
very
ministry.
complicated because the actual unfolding of it took a long time. So they did invite me, but by the time it happened, I couldn't do it. So I really wasn't at that point. But I did preach at that church over the years.
Yeah.
And certainly, it is the church family that made me who I am in terms of as a person of faith.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I had a unique opportunity at my church in Dallas to help plant a church in Houston, actually, and that church is still going. It's a very different form than what I helped plant. But the reason it's still going is because it's a different form than what I helped plant. And actually, their pastor has become a friend and colleague and is very gifted. And so I can't speak to this experience. What I have experienced in both denominations that I've served in is significant decline of churches that I've either been a part of or have helped lead. And that's always tough to see, even though my head knows what mainline churches face today and the uphill climb that we face. But to see it lived out is tough. Even if I go back to a childhood church that my father served, or a church that I was a part of that's not as vibrant as it once was, it's tough to see.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about church closings and grief, and I wonder if the church, if we don't place enough of an emphasis on caring for people who come to our churches because they're leaving a church which is closing or has closed. I think about the pandemic, which has caused so many churches to close or are closing that were kind of on the edge before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And, when that hit, it was just, they could not pivot, to doing hybrid worship or online worship, and that kind of made the decision for them. And I just think we need to think intentionally about ministering to people who have gone through that experience, because it's a death and it's a loss. And I'm gonna move on. So before I do, I want to ask, do you have any more thoughts or reflections about churches closing?
No, I just would echo what you said about, I really don't know what the long-term effect of the pandemic is going to be. It has certainly changed people's patterns of worship, whether they've stopped worshiping or they worship online, their local church or another church that they found they like the services of. And I think we need to be honest about the challenges that presents, and not judge either ourselves or anyone else for the impact. I mean, it's just very difficult, and we've done better than many, even though we too have faced challenges.
Yeah,
it's interesting as both of you know, I'm kind of a dork about some of these kind of statistics, but 90% of churches in the United Church of Christ before the pandemic had no way of broadcasting worship. So they couldn't live stream. They didn't have any capability to do that. And so I just think about how fortunate this church was to have had the vision to establish that. And then we are fortunate to have people now who are able to do so much more than what I would call a simple live stream. I mean, it's a true production. And I've seen some statistics that talk about a third of churches will not make it past the pandemic.
Really?
Because of the financial strain, because of the changed patterns of behavior, things like that. And so I don't know a single church or a single pastor that I'm colleagues with that hasn't been impacted significantly. But, to think about how significant it will be, and like you said, Sharon, I don't think we've yet to even figure out how deep that impact may be. Again, I think we're very fortunate we have visionary leaders who have been strategic the whole way, but we feel it. We see the impacts of it all around us.
Yeah, and if that statistic, that predictive statistic is correct, that 1/3 of local churches are going to close their doors, we are really going to have to get serious, those of us who are able to weather the storm, in terms of how we engage those folks who have
Yeah,
lost their
and I
churches.
want to lift up that I think you raise a really interesting issue that's really important that I've not thought about, and that is, what does ministry to and among people who have left a church that's closed?
Yeah.
Like because I think that's different than people who either make a choice to leave a church,
Yeah.
who have perhaps not been churched in many
Yeah.
years or moved or, but I do think that coming to a church after you've left one that's closed, I think looks different. I think there's different trust issues. I think there's anxieties that are different.
Absolutely.
All of that. And I think you raised some interesting points there that I think we should be talking about as a team and with our leadership about and things like that.
At my former congregation, a couple came to our church because their local church was closing, and they were one of the last few members left, and they described themselves as refugees.
Yeah.
Because they said we're kind of forced out of our homeland, our home church, if you will, and so integrating them into the life of our church was very different from, someone you'd welcome who was a friend of a church member or any other circumstances, and having to be sensitive to that. So.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the leadership of Rachel's church, the mission, as we are church leaders. And I want to specifically focus on Brian. He was, my understanding is the founding pastor, Brian Ward. And on page 101, she says, at first, Brian forfeited a comfortable megachurch salary to move to Dayton to start the mission, working full-time in the Walmart automotive department, changing people's oil and selling them tires. And then, 7 pages later on page 108, she's talking about the closing of the church, and she says, when Brian said he needed to start looking for another job in ministry, one that would actually pay the bills, no one objected. He found one in Florida at a United Methodist church that needed a youth pastor, and he and Carrie and the girls would leave in just a few weeks. And this, I actually forget how long the mission was open, but I think it was just a few years. So, Brian's journey from idealistic, passing up a great megachurch salary and really kind of making that sacrifice and working at Walmart to pay the bills so he could pour his heart and soul into this church that he really believed in, to realizing the reality, which was that, as one of my friends said, we can't pay the bills with prayers and good wishes.
Yeah.
And, the hard reality that he had a family that he needed to help support. And so he had to leave the mission and find something more stable. How many idealistic people go into ministry thinking God will provide a way. If I'm called to this ministry, God will make it possible for me to pay my bills, and are just kind of like wide-eyed and believe that, if God has called this to happen, the money will flow. And then are met with, more a fiscal reality. And I want to ask each of you, personally, what has been your, financial journey in ministry, and how has it affected your decision making? And how do we think that economics affects the church? Okay, I'll pause because that's a whole other can of worms in itself. We'll get to how economics affects kind of the wider church landscape. But what are your reflections on, pastors having to support themselves, because that's the capitalist reality we live in, while at the same time really feeling called to serve God?
40,000. That's the average seminarian debt today, is $40,000.
Really?
Yeah. And, so serving on a theological school's board of trustees, a lot of the conversations that we have is this tension, right, between how do we provide quality education for the future of the church, and then graduate students who are not so encumbered with debt that they can't provide for their families or themselves. Because, the average, I can't remember the average starting salary in the United Church of Christ today, but, thinking about what it likely is in the neighborhood of, like, you qualify to not have to have a deferred loan payment because you can't even meet the minimum salary of what's required for the loan repayment. So, I mean, you just create this conundrum and frankly, a hopeless feeling. I mean, one of the most hopeless things I've done in ministry is listen to a group of seminarians, and with the number of degrees I have, I'm still paying off student loans to this day. I'm well compensated. It's not an issue for me, but for many people, it is. And so I just think about at that level, what can happen. And I was trying to remember, we're given statistics in the Next Generation Leadership Initiative about turnover of clergy within the first 10 years. And I think it's like half.
Yeah.
Like half of all clergy in the first 10 years leave ministry. And, and I'm sure that's for lots of reasons. Money is one of them, is probably one of the top ones. But, those are, burnout, resources, and I just think about just the myriad of issues that face clergy today. And so I'm grateful for churches like Naples United Church of Christ that are committed to paying not only a living wage, but paying and compensating well. High expectations come with those compensations, but there's still a level of commitment there that not every church can afford. So I think it's a huge issue for the church of the future, especially as we talk about the church post-pandemic.
It's interesting. The question made me think about people I went to seminary with, and I realized that a number of people who graduated with me, which was 1980, so it was a while ago, did not go into pastoral ministry. And I don't know all of the reasons. Some probably financial, some just the stress of the job and the lifestyle. I also think about, for the 15 years before I retired and we moved to Naples, I was teaching students in a small Christian college who wanted to be teachers. And we had exactly the same conversation, that they were paying a lot for their liberal arts education to go into teaching and not have a salary that would necessarily allow them to pay back their loans. And it seems to me we just have so much that is awry in our whole system. Personally, I have always been very fortunate because I was married to somebody I am married to somebody who has been able to provide financially so that my family's well-being didn't depend on my salary and what I got in ministry or in other kinds of positions. But I do think it's not just the financial, it's also being on call 24/7 and the demands and expectations that cause people to leave ministry and that high turnover.
And I think about how those folks who are encumbered with debt, seminary debt, undergraduate debt, or those folks who have a family to support, how their fiscal realities affect the ways they're able to serve in ministry. And the problem is that I think areas of our country that have the greatest need for well-qualified, vibrant, and energetic pastors are the ones that are, kind of economic deserts that don't have the infrastructure to support to pour money into a new church start or to sustain a church, and I think about some of our smallest churches that are struggling or that have a lot of potential, or the churches that are like a multi-point parish. And what that means for our listeners who aren't aware is a few churches will get together that none of them can afford a full-time pastor's salary, so they'll get together and kind of share a full-time pastor, and that's great cooperative work. But those aren't often the most appealing settings for folks. And so you think about the churches, again, that maybe because they're small or because they're healing from something that was, traumatic and divisive, or whatever the case may be, they need the pastors that are the most capable with the most gifts and really have the heart and soul to pour energy into rebuilding that location. But again, they're the ones that don't have the means to pay people. And so our well-equipped pastors go, for lack of a better phrase, where the money is. And maybe those are the areas that are more comfortable, and maybe, thinking about, are there partnerships that can be made between more well-financed churches and, areas that are not as economically prosperous or something, so that the spreading of the UCC's message is not limited to where the money is.
Well, and one issue that we haven't spoken to, but it plays into all of this, is, as we see across the nation right now, is the skyrocketing housing prices. And I know that you and Andy can speak to this personally if we want to have like a testimony time. But, we see it here in Southwest Florida, but again, across the nation.
Yeah.
And especially in a system like ours right now that has not a lot, I don't think, but, there are some parsonages, housing allowances, so buying in and out of the system can also be challenging. And so, and again, it's about the market being up or down and, things like that. And so how can churches be best equipped to help clergy buy homes or get into homes or, things like that, because they can't control the housing market.
Yeah.
And, and so those are issues that complicate things. And affordable housing is an issue across the board, but it does affect whether or not clergy can if that can be possible.
So to put in a word of hope, I do think one of the ways that the church can deal with some of this is with what I understand, at least, has been an influx over the years of non-traditional clergy, people who come in their 40s or 50s, maybe they've raised their families, they've paid off their undergraduate student loans, they go back to seminary, they're not in the same challenge of raising kids and paying for college, some of that's behind them. I think that is at least one source of some leadership for churches that we shouldn't forget about.
Well, and one of the things I'm most proud of Chicago Theological Seminary is we were the first seminary to offer a completely online Master of Divinity, because, like when my father and aunt and uncle went to seminary, and probably your parents as well, like it was the common thing to do was you loaded up the U-Haul, you moved to seminary, everybody lived in graduate student housing, that's what you did. Well, I was able to do that, and my brother was able to do that for a time, but then the pattern has changed. And for instance, Wesley Snedeker, who was ordained here and grew up in this congregation, he did his Master's of Divinity, I would say 96% online. And so he could stay here in Florida. He worked with us and for us and worked with those in Immokalee and things like that, but was able to do his education. And so it becomes more affordable. It becomes much more flexible for the student. And so, again, there are smart people working very hard to make it a much more approachable system. So you're right, Sharon. I think there is hope on the horizon. In some ways, I think we did kind of sound a little down.
Down there, sorry. But also,
and I'll send you my student loan bill next.
And so, the UCC is also embracing new paths towards ordination, which don't necessarily include the traditional 3-year Master's of Divinity degree. As important a role as seminaries do play in the life of many of our folks in their theological training, not everybody. And so that's also kind of a creative way that folks are getting trained in order to be equipped to be ordained without going to seminary.
Yeah, and I would be remiss also if I did not say I'm part of a small group with the pension boards that's also working to help address student debt, so that there are affordable options to help clergy refinance student debt at a more affordable rate. And it is amazing how quickly that can change your financial picture. And so I anticipate that those programs will be rolled out in the next few years, and that will also change the course of the church of the future very quickly. And I'm excited about some of those things.
And I'm really glad you mentioned parsonages as well, because parsonages were very common. Those are, for the folks who don't know, those are houses that churches own, that their pastor and family live in. They were very common, and then they kind of went out of vogue for a while, and all the churches were selling off their parsonages because pastors didn't want to live in church-owned housing. They wanted to buy their own house or live in the area of the community where they wanted. And now, because of the housing market, parsonages are experiencing a resurgence in popularity. And I know churches that converted their parsonages to office space or to, for youth ministry, are now converting them back into housing for the pastor, or they're buying how they sold their parsonage years ago. The pastors didn't want them. Now they're buying houses to, turn back into parsonages again. So it's very interesting how we are able to be creative and adapt and overcome.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Being adaptive.
we'll end this section on that positive note.
Thank you, Sharon.
And that brings us to chapter 15, Epic Fail. Wah, wah. And this is about how Rachel writes about how Christians need to reframe success and failure, and how maybe viewing failure through the lens of being shameful and bad and wrong and, something that we hide and feel guilty about is not accurate or healthy, and that we should think about failure as being learning experiences and opportunities for new growth and new understandings of ministry and new ways of being followers of Christ in our world. And she says on page 112, Christians may need to get used to the idea of measuring significance by something other than money, fame, and power. Because in our society, if you have, that is the trifecta. If you have money, fame, and power, you are successful. And as soon as you start losing any of those, you're lower and lower in status. And if you don't have any of them, it's like, well, what good are you? You have no value, literally, because money is, money has value. And so I was reflecting after reading this chapter about how maybe pastors need to be more honest about how we get it wrong and be more vulnerable, and for us to model what it looks like to fail, and to be honest about our sins, about our dreams that we don't achieve, these goals that we have that we never accomplish, and our failures, in order to invite others to do the same. I think that as ministers, people hold us up on this pedestal and expect us to be the most upright example of what it means to follow Christ, what it means to be faithful, what it means to be Christian, what it means to have a concise and clear understanding of God, what it means to be a good public speaker and interpret the Bible accurately, and have it a very active prayer life, and have really healthy relationships with everyone in your life, because we are really good at all this stuff. But I know you're both laughing, because we are hardly good at all of those things all the time. And I think that what it means to be a minister is not to be good at all of that, but to be constantly trying, and to be modeling what it means to show up every day and say, maybe I didn't get it right yesterday. Maybe I fell down. Maybe I screwed up. Maybe I talked out of turn. Maybe I said the wrong thing. Maybe I lost my temper. Maybe I got impatient with God. Maybe I doubted God's existence. But to show up the next day and say, all right, I'm going to try again, and to kind of model that constant cycle that we go out throughout our lives while we're on our journeys of faith, those ebbs and flows of mountaintop experiences, absolutely, but valley experiences as well, when we are in the pit, and what that means, and what it means to fail, and how it informs us. And, a privilege we have as ministers is to tell those valley experience stories, but not stay there. We don't stay in the valley, and what it means to come out of it, and the resources that we use to come out of it, and how we can journey alongside others out of those failures into a place of hopefully deeper faithfulness. So what are your thoughts? What are your reflections on, Rachel's chapter here about failure, the word, the importance of it in our personal lives and in our roles as church leaders?
I was thinking, it's almost 3 years now that I've been a part of the clergy team, and that one of the blessings of that experience, and there are many, but has been the tone that Dawson has set in terms of valuing vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of the clergy team in particular, and beyond that somewhat to the staff team, there is that core value. And that's been very freeing for me, and it has allowed me to experience blessings of acceptance and forgiveness and just experiencing God's love in that way. I think it's a different step in some ways to try to be that vulnerable with the congregation,
Yeah,
especially
absolutely.
a large congregation like this,
Yeah.
because that's a big risk, because that might mean, okay, I just acknowledged this way that I screwed this up, and so they say, fine, thank you very much. And so I don't know how you do that on a grander scale. I mean, for me, that some of that is in an interpersonal thing. Now, can I, in preaching, use examples of those valleys or of the times that I've made mistakes and really learned from them? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference between close interpersonal relationships and how you share with a whole congregation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate that, Sharon, and you're someone that's helped us set that tone. I was afraid you were going to say that working with me has shown you so much failure to be modeled. And, you know, I just think about, like, the Benedictines who say, every day we begin again, you know, and I think about how so often I have to think about that in my own prayer life, devotion life. You know, it's like I go home at night and think, ooh, okay, that didn't go the way that day, you know, didn't go the way I'd hoped. And, you know, and so, okay, every day we begin again. You know, I'm going to try that tomorrow. And you know, one of the things I love about being a pastor is the complexity of it. And one of the things that's so challenging is the complexity of it. And I think, I can't remember who it was, but you know, there's a study that says that ministers are supposed to be experts in about 14 different professional fields, you know, from accounting to HR to
Plumbing
to, you know, all of the
Roofing.
things. Yeah. And now, and frankly, I think that study was done before technology and, you know, IT specialists and, you know, things like that. But yet what I love is no day is ever the same. And so, you know, it's never boring. Some days I'd like boring, you know, and so I think about, how do we define failure and how do we define shame and what does that look like? And, you know, I think there's a lot of stuff, but you know, what Sharon raised is kind of where my head went, is how do we create an environment, a community, a sense of accountability where it's appropriate for clergy and others to be that vulnerable and that open, but it doesn't come with, we appreciate that, but here are the boxes for you to pack your office. I mean, like, and actually, I had a colleague who shared with me at one point, because I was saying, like, you know, I have plenty of valley experiences to use in the pulpit, but, you know, what is that appropriate line? And they talked about how it's only appropriate to use it if you've worked through it.
Yeah.
Like, don't, you know, as one of my preaching professors would say, don't bleed in front of the congregation. Like, don't, you know,
preach from your scars, not your open wounds.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, those are, you know, things to understand. But, you know, in the middle of a nasty church fight, I mean, Christians can dole it out better than most I've seen. And so, you know, how do we create an environment where people can embody that vulnerability? And, I'm sure there are people who have figured it out a lot faster and better than me. What I know is that I decided that if we can start at the proverbial top and work our way down, that's how we would do it on the staff side.
Yeah.
Congregations, it's tough stuff. I mean, I'm not going to act like it's just really easy, because it's not.
Yeah.
I just have to tell you, you're saying that reminds me, one of those single lines that my preaching professor a long time ago said. He talked about, this is a kind of what you do not do, and talked about somebody who got up in the pulpit and said, I was going to preach about hope today, but I don't have any.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what you don't do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, there have been times where I've sat in front of, my laptop and thought to myself, okay, God, like, speak now, or, I'm going to be I don't have much to say, but that's usually when I know it's time for me to have a week or two out of the pulpit, or to go on vacation, or, something, just because some of it's usually fatigue, not more than that. But there are times where it's like, no, I just need to back away for a little while.
And I think it's important even for us to think about how we reframe failure and success, because she writes in this chapter about the mission, that she started with 10 or 20 other people, and she said it failed epically. She called it an unsuccessful church plant, and I wish... unfortunately, she passed away, far too soon. I would love to ask her, because she doesn't go into why she uses that word fail. And my guess is, if she was sitting with us, that she would say because it didn't last as long as they had wanted or they had hoped. And so that got me thinking, what makes a local church successful? I mean, what metrics are we using? Where did we get those from? I mean, should we be like going back to the scriptures and thinking about, the earliest disciples after Jesus was crucified, and what those gatherings looked like in their homes when they were terrified and frightened, or, when Paul was traveling around establishing churches, what does a successful church look like, and at what point are you established enough to say, okay, we are successful? And you said that your church, that closed its doors, it served a purpose, and it was there for a period of time, and it served the families that came all day while it existed, and it had a sunrise and a sunset, as every local church does eventually. And so it's just, at what point is it like, oh, that church plant, was because she says that they changed lives. I mean, we on page 113, we baptized and broke bread. We preached the word and confessed our sins. We created a sanctuary where people told the truth without fear. We fed the hungry and filled out paperwork with the sick. We worked through our differences with care and grace. And that sounds like church to me. I mean, Jesus says where two or more are gathered, I am present among you. And so I think that so often we use kind of society's metrics of success and apply them to the church. And you have to have this number of people in the pews or viewing you online. You have to have this number of dollars in the bank. You have to have all of these metrics, and then you're successful, because that is what society says. If you've got this many people purchasing your product and you've got this many dollars in sales, then you're successful. But I wonder if this isn't an opportunity for the church to be, countercultural in that way, and for us to say that is not how we define success and failure. We define success by lives touched or lives changed, people affected, hearts open, relationships formed, fists unclenched, hearts softened, that kind of thing. And it's really, those are not very quantifiable. It's very hard to measure those kinds of things. But if that's the way we define the success of church, and if every church viewed their ministries through that lens, how many more would transition from feeling like a failure to saying, oh no, we're doing something right. We might not have a ton of people, and we might not have a ton of money, but those who are connected to us, their lives are positively influenced. So I just want to close the failure section on that note about redefining failure. And then the last chapter we'll cover during tonight's section is chapter 16, feet, which I will be totally honest, makes me so squeamish. Ooh. There's just something that gives me the heebie-jeebies about that, but it's okay. We're going to talk about this. The sacrament of foot washing. It is modeled for us by Jesus in the Gospels when he washed his disciples' feet. She talks about that powerful moment. I remember reading about it in the news right after when Pope Francis was elected. It was traditional for the new pope to wash the feet of 12 cardinals, but instead, he went to a local juvenile detention center and washed the feet of 12 prisoners, and how powerful that was. And I think that there's something so powerful in that precisely because of the reaction it gave me, because feet are gross, and it's like, if you are willing to humble yourself and wash someone's feet, like, talk about physical touch and the intimacy of it and the vulnerability of it. And so I have to ask you all, have either of you participated in a foot washing service? Has Naples United Church of Christ ever had foot washing? What are your thoughts about it? Discuss amongst yourselves.
I have not, so I cannot speak to it.
Yeah, so I'm aware of Naples UCC having done it many years ago, not on a congregation-wide scale, but as part of a Holy Week observance and a reenactment. Actually, my previous church did it on multiple occasions, and what's interesting is my reaction is actually the opposite. I will wash feet all day long. Let's not quote me on that. But when I am most uncomfortable is when someone's washing my feet.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the intimacy of that, and because I am much more comfortable serving than being served.
Oh, that is.
And so, like, my growing edge spiritually, emotionally, relationally, is to allow myself to be served, to ask for help, to that's my growing edge, because I would much rather say, no, let me, than to say, to allow that for myself. Yeah. So it's very interesting, especially as pastors, as servants, as the hands and feet of Christ, in the traditional sense. I'm much more comfortable with that than someone saying, now let me wash your feet. Yeah. And so that was actually, we used, in my former church, we would do it on typically the Wednesday of Holy Week. Yeah. That was actually kind of a tradition. And you were invited to come in pairs, and if you didn't have someone with you, then the pastor at that particular station would wash your feet, and then you would wash their feet. So I would end up having my feet washed multiple times. And I just remember thinking, maybe someday this won't be so uncomfortable having my feet washed. I was happy to wash other people's feet. But so it's an interesting experience, and it pushes every button and boundary for people. And
I participated in foot washing services, Monday, Thursday services here in Florida at churches I worshiped at, and appreciated the vulnerability of it. But I will be honest with you, before those services, I got a pedicure.
Well, I was actually going to say,
because I was
typically
I can't actually have nasty feet, which is the irony of it, because it's not actual foot washing. It's symbolic at that point, which there's still a power to that, but there's, but you think about Jesus' time, and when he washed his disciples' feet, I mean, they did not have paved roads. They were not bathing regularly. I mean, they were wearing sandals. Their feet were dirty. And for him to do that just models the, as Rachel calls it, the upside down kingdom of God, this powerful modeling of humility. And really quickly, before we wrap up, she shares a story about her sister Amanda, who she described as present and kind. And Rachel Held Evans goes into the priesthood of all believers, which is that, we're all able to be Christ embodied in this world. We're all able to be priests. You don't have to have the ordination in order to, embody that identity. And she says that her sister Amanda is a perfect example of this, because that she was present and kind. And she quotes Barbara Brown Taylor, who's one of my favorite authors and pastors, on page 117, saying, "To be a priest is to know that things are not as they should be, and yet to care for them the way they are." Mm-hmm. And I had to sit with that for a moment because I often want to change that which I care for. I care for it, and with self motivations and ulterior motives to say, okay, I'm caring for you, but you're going to come alongside me to go the way I want. And so that is certainly part of my trouble. But needing to work on loving people, loving institutions, and systems where they are, even if they're not as they should be. Learning to wash feet, even if they're not as you think they are. Have my own feet washed, even if I'm, uncomfortable with the state that they're in. And so that's my closing thought. And before we wrap up, Sharon or Dawson, did either of you want to offer closing words this evening?
I would just say, I didn't know that we shared this in common, but I too love Barbara Brown Taylor. She also writes in one of her books, actually, interestingly, Leaving Church, that one of the gifts of being clergy is also holding things up to God and calling them blessed.
Oh, yeah.
And I often cling to that on good days and bad. And so I don't offer that as counterpoint, but to say that I agree with you that can be one of the challenges of being ordained is, you have to kind of live where things are, but also on those days where we get that unique privilege of holding things up. And I think you don't have to be ordained to do that either.
No, I would just say very quickly that the priesthood of all believers is like core value to me. And I realized in reading what she wrote that it's not so much the priestly role as it is the notion that we are all involved in ministry.
Yes.
And that whether you're a school teacher or a bus driver or a physician or an engineer, I mean, all of us have opportunities to be engaged in ministry with other people. And that's just how I think about every person in the congregation, and that's just a core value.
Yeah. Amen to that. What a beautiful note to close on. Everybody who is watching and listening, you are ministers of the gospel. It's your responsibility to help be the hands and feet of Christ in our world, because God knows us ordained folks can't do it on our own.
Yes.
So won't you be in a spirit of prayer with me as I offer our closing prayer this evening. Abiding God, I thank you for being present at this table with myself and my colleagues, Sharon and Dawson. I thank you for everyone who makes this clergy roundtable possible. I thank you for everyone who is watching this, who is listening to it, who is engaging with it with their eyes and their ears and their minds. I hope that something that we spoke about tonight sparks their interest and invites them to be in deeper relationship with you, O God, for indeed this is why we do all things, because we are your servants in the service of others. And I ask you to bless us as we all go our separate ways. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Sharon, Dawson. It is always a privilege. Thank you, audiovisual people. Thank you, viewers. Thank you, listeners. So tune in next week for our session on communion, which will be facilitated by Sharon. Good night, everybody.
Good night.